Is it possible for an army that still fields thousands of tanks and missiles to be quietly collapsing from within? On a freezing night at the end of 2025, the answer seemed to emerge from a ruined house near the southern front, where 3 exhausted soldiers were discovered, hiding inside a stove, shaking disarmed and begging to surrender. That single moment captured in low light amid smoke and rubble did not represent an anomaly or a lapse in discipline. It was a snapshot of a deeper crisis spreading across multiple Russian formations, one that has accelerated sharply over the past year. While official statements continued to speak of advances and resilience, battlefield behavior told a very different story, one defined by fear, exhaustion, and the instinct to survive at any cost. Throughout 2025, reports from multiple fronts indicated a surge in Russian soldiers abandoning positions, laying down weapons, or disappearing altogether. The scale was unprecedented in modern Russian military history. Entire platoons dissolved without combat, not because of overwhelming enemy fire, but because morale had collapsed. In several sectors, surrender was no longer a last resort after encirclement, but a proactive decision made before contact. Soldiers crossed lines in daylight, discarded equipment in plain view, and openly ignored orders that promised punishment, but no protection. The contrast between official claims and lived reality grew impossible to conceal even within Russia's own command structure. What made this breakdown especially striking was its geographic spread. From southern axes to eastern defensive belts, similar patterns emerged almost simultaneously. Units rotated from one sector to another carried the same behaviors with them: reluctance to advance, refusal to hold exposed positions, and growing distrust of commanders. Orders increasingly sounded disconnected from conditions on the ground, demanding attacks without artillery cover, logistics support, or realistic objectives. Each failed push reinforced the perception among rank-and-file soldiers that survival depended not on obedience but on escape. Fear of drones, precision strikes, and relentless artillery outweighed fear of military courts or political slogans. Behind these individual decisions lay a systemic failure in force management. Years of attrition had hollowed out experienced cadres, replacing them with hastily trained recruits, contract soldiers motivated primarily by money, and men coerced by circumstance rather than conviction. As losses mounted, units were replenished numerically, but not functionally. New arrivals often lacked cohesion, shared identity, or trust in leadership. In such conditions, the social glue that holds military formations together dissolved rapidly under pressure. The battlefield became less a place of coordinated action and more a landscape of isolated individuals calculating personal risk. This erosion was compounded by the visibility of abandonment. Wounded soldiers left without evacuation units, denied reinforcement, and promises of rotation repeatedly broken created a powerful narrative among troops. Once sent forward, there would be no rescue. Stories circulated faster than official orders, spreading through informal channels and reinforcing fatalism. When soldiers believe they are expendable, discipline loses its moral foundation. Obedience becomes transactional, and once the transaction fails, loyalty evaporates. In 2025, that evaporation reached critical mass. The symbolic power of surrender also changed. What once carried shame increasingly carried relief. Soldiers who returned alive from captivity, fed and treated, became silent proof that another outcome was possible. This perception mattered more than propaganda or punishment. Each successful surrender lowered the psychological barrier for the next one, creating a feedback loop that commanders struggled to break. Attempts to restore control through harsher laws and threats only confirmed soldiers' belief that the system valued coercion over care. By late 2025, the gap between Moscow's narrative and frontline reality had become a strategic liability. An army can endure losses, but it cannot function when belief collapses faster than manpower. The image of soldiers hiding in a stove was not just a moment of fear. It was a metaphor for an institution retreating inward, trying to survive its own contradictions. If this was the visible surface of the crisis, how deep did the structure beneath it already fracture? And what would happen when fear fully replaced obedience as the dominant force shaping behavior at the front? If surrender had once been portrayed as weakness, by 2025, it had evolved into a calculated survival strategy shaped by structure, communication, and trust. The shift did not occur spontaneously on the battlefield. It was the result of sustained psychological pressure intersecting with unbearable conditions. Soldiers facing relentless drone surveillance, precision strikes, and chronic shortages began to reassess what loyalty meant when the system offering orders could no longer offer protection. In this environment, the concept of surrender transformed from an act of desperation into an alternative pathway out of a war that no longer made sense to those fighting it. What distinguished this phase from earlier conflicts was organization. Surrender was no longer improvised or chaotic. It followed clear steps that reduced uncertainty, fear, and the risk of retaliation. Soldiers learned often before deployment that there were channels to signal intent, coordinate movement, and ensure safety. This knowledge mattered. In war, uncertainty kills faster than bullets. Knowing that surrender could be managed rather than guessed at lowered the psychological threshold dramatically. It replaced panic with planning, even under fire. The appeal of this option was amplified by comparison. Conditions inside Russian units had deteriorated to the point where basic survival was no longer guaranteed. Food shortages, inconsistent medical care, and the routine abandonment of wounded created a grim calculus. Against this backdrop, the promise of predictable treatment, adherence to international norms, and contact with family carried extraordinary weight. For soldiers who had spent months eating spoiled rations and sleeping under constant threat, dignity became more valuable than ideology. Survival, not victory, became the primary objective. This shift also revealed something deeper about the composition of the force. The majority of those choosing surrender were not ideological opponents of the war. They were people with limited social or economic leverage before enlistment. Many had joined under financial pressure, legal coercion, or deception. When reality contradicted promises, their attachment to the mission collapsed quickly. Unlike professional soldiers with long-term institutional identity, these individuals had little reason to endure indefinite risk for abstract goals. The war offered them no future worth dying for. The ripple effects inside units were profound. Each surrender undermined collective discipline, not through betrayal, but through demonstration. Soldiers saw proof that disobedience could lead to life rather than punishment. This observation mattered more than any official decree. Once the idea took hold that survival was possible outside the chain of command, authority eroded rapidly. Commanders faced a dilemma: acknowledge the reality and risk encouraging more defections, or deny it and lose credibility altogether. Most chose denial, which only accelerated the process. Attempts to counter this trend relied heavily on fear. Laws criminalizing surrender and threats of long prison sentences were meant to restore control, but they failed to account for battlefield psychology. Under immediate threat, abstract future punishment carries little deterrent value. A soldier confronted by an approaching drone does not weigh years in prison against seconds of life. In practice, repression confirmed what many already believed: the system prioritized control over survival. That realization pushed more soldiers toward exit strategies rather than compliance. By late 2025, surrender had become a form of silent protest as much as a survival choice. It exposed the gap between political narratives and operational reality, turning individual decisions into a collective signal of institutional failure. Each defection weakened not just numbers, but trust cohesion and the belief that endurance would be rewarded. If an army cannot convince its soldiers that obedience leads to life rather than death, can coercion alone sustain it, or does the normalization of surrender mark the point where control becomes irreversibly symbolic? When reports began circulating that cooks, drivers, and mechanics were being sent into frontline trenches, many dismissed them as exaggeration. By mid-2025, however, these accounts formed a consistent pattern confirmed across multiple sectors. What initially sounded like a grim anecdote revealed a structural emergency, the collapse of the balance between combat forces and the support systems that sustain them. In military terms, this imbalance signaled a force consuming itself, sacrificing long-term functionality for short-term survival. Modern armies rely on a delicate ratio between fighters and those who keep them supplied, fed, transported, and repaired. This ratio is not a luxury, but a requirement. When frontline losses outpace the ability to replace trained infantry commanders, face a brutal choice: abandon positions or strip support units to fill gaps. The decision to deploy non-combat personnel as infantry reflected not creativity, but desperation. It acknowledged that reserves were exhausted and that replenishment pipelines could no longer keep up with attrition. The immediate effect was deceptively positive. Trenches appeared manned, numbers on paper stabilized, and orders could still be executed, at least briefly. But beneath the surface, this solution accelerated collapse. Every cook sent forward meant fewer meals, lower caloric intake, and declining physical resilience for those remaining. Every mechanic killed or wounded meant vehicles left unrepaired, not because of catastrophic damage, but because no one remained who knew how to fix them. Expensive equipment turned into abandoned hulks, not due to enemy fire but organizational decay. Logistics failures compounded operational paralysis. Ammunition deliveries slowed as drivers were reassigned or lost. Medical evacuations suffered as support networks fractured. The battlefield became littered with functional weapon systems rendered useless by minor faults. In this environment, combat effectiveness declined even in units that had not yet faced heavy fighting. Morale followed the same downward trajectory. Soldiers understood intuitively that when support staff are sent to fight, the institution has entered a terminal phase of improvisation. This phenomenon also altered command behavior. Leaders accustomed to managing systems found themselves managing scarcity. Decisions became reactive rather than strategic, focused on holding ground for hours or days rather than shaping outcomes. Orders emphasized endurance, without offering means demanding sacrifice, while stripping away the very structures that made sacrifice meaningful. Over time, this eroded the legitimacy of leadership in the eyes of subordinates. Authority that cannot provide sustenance loses its moral claim. The broader implication was a feedback loop of degradation. As logistics weakened, frontline units suffered more casualties. As casualties increased, more support personnel were pulled forward. Each cycle accelerated the next. What emerged was not an army adapting under pressure, but an organism cannibalizing its own organs to delay collapse. This dynamic explained why territorial control often failed to translate into lasting advantage. Positions gained at high cost could not be sustained because the infrastructure behind them had been gutted. From a strategic perspective, this shift carried consequences beyond the battlefield. An army that erodes its own support structure loses the ability to recover, rotate, and regenerate. Even pauses in fighting offered little relief because the institutional capacity to rebuild had been consumed. Observers noted that this pattern marked a transition from conventional warfare to managed decay, where the goal became postponing failure rather than achieving victory. By late 2025, the phrase "everyone fights" no longer signaled unity, but desperation. It revealed a force trapped by its own losses, unable to restore balance without acknowledging the scale of its depletion. When an army reaches the point where feeding itself competes with defending itself, the question is no longer whether it can advance, but how long it can function at all before structural exhaustion turns tactical holding actions into irreversible collapse. By 2025, desertion was no longer an incidental byproduct of war, but a measurable phenomenon with its own internal logic. The numbers told a story of fear overtaking coercion and mathematics, replacing ideology as the dominant force shaping behavior. Military courts processed tens of thousands of cases related to absence without leave, refusal to report, and outright abandonment. Yet these figures represented only the visible layer of a much larger problem. Many disappearances never reached legal records, quietly absorbed into categories like missing in action or unaccounted losses, masking the true scale of erosion. What changed most significantly was the nature of desertion itself. Earlier in the war, many soldiers simply failed to return from leave. By mid-2025, desertions increasingly occurred directly from combat zones, often under fire. Soldiers fled with weapons, crossed forests at night, or surrendered in small groups during active operations. This shift indicated not opportunism, but desperation. Leaving from the front carried enormous risk, yet it was chosen over remaining in positions perceived as fatal. When desertion becomes more dangerous than obedience, the system's deterrents have lost their power. Legal repression intensified in response. New statutes criminalized surrender, extended prison sentences, and expanded commanders' authority to punish. Barrier units were reportedly positioned behind frontline troops to deter retreat. On paper, these measures projected control. In practice, they exposed panic. Soldiers understood that the threat of future punishment meant little compared to immediate death. Fear, when overused, ceases to motivate and instead paralyzes. Faced with drones overhead and artillery incoming, the calculation narrowed to minutes and meters, not years in a cell. The data revealed who was leaving. A large majority of deserters were contract soldiers, individuals drawn by financial incentives rather than long-term service identity. For them, the transactional nature of enlistment became painfully clear. Money lost its value when survival odds collapsed. Conscripts appeared less frequently in desertion statistics, not because of loyalty, but because many never had the opportunity to flee. Deployed to the most dangerous sectors with minimal training, they were often killed or wounded before desertion became an option. Statistics in this sense understated the human cost. This pattern highlighted a fundamental contradiction. The system relied on coercion to compensate for declining motivation, yet coercion accelerated the very behavior it sought to prevent. Each harsh sentence confirmed soldiers' belief that they were disposable. Trust eroded not only between ranks, but within units as fear of informants and punishment replaced cohesion. In such an atmosphere, mutual reliance, the cornerstone of combat effectiveness, became impossible. Soldiers planned escape individually, not survival collectively. Desertion also exposed the limits of information control. Even as official messaging minimized losses and emphasized resolve, informal networks carried more credible accounts of reality. Soldiers believed what they saw and heard from peers, not what they were told from above. The discrepancy between lived experience and official narrative widened until orders themselves lost credibility. When authority is perceived as detached from truth, compliance becomes optional rather than obligatory. By the end of 2025, Desertion had become both symptom and driver of institutional decay. It reflected a force unable to align risk-reward and purpose. Punishment alone could not restore balance because the underlying contract between state and soldier had fractured. If fear no longer binds individuals to the mission, and incentives no longer justify the risk, what mechanism remains to sustain large-scale operations, and how long can any military endure when absence becomes rational behavior? Beyond the battlefield, the war's most enduring damage unfolded quietly across society, reshaping demographics, economies, and regional stability inside Russia. By 2025, casualty patterns revealed a stark imbalance that could not be explained by chance or operational necessity alone. Losses were disproportionately concentrated in poorer remote regions, while major urban centers remained relatively insulated. This disparity reflected not only recruitment practices, but political calculation, shielding socially influential populations from the full cost of the conflict, while exporting risk to those with the least capacity to resist. Entire communities felt the absence. Villages across eastern and southern regions saw their working-age male population shrink dramatically within months. Farms lacked labor, factories struggled to operate, and local economies stalled. The social consequences extended beyond immediate productivity. Marriage rates fell, birth rates declined, and families were left fragmented. For many households, compensation payments replaced long-term income, creating short-term relief at the expense of generational stability. Money arrived where people did not. Ethnic and regional disparities sharpened existing inequalities. Minority populations bore a far higher share of fatalities relative to their population size, reinforcing perceptions that the war functioned as a mechanism of selective sacrifice. This perception eroded trust in central authority, particularly among communities that already felt marginalized. Over time, grief transformed into quiet resentment, not expressed openly, but embedded in demographic data and migration patterns. Young men who might once have stayed left when possible, accelerating depopulation. The recruitment of foreign nationals added another layer of complexity. Individuals drawn from economically vulnerable regions abroad found themselves integrated into units with little institutional protection. Their status remained ambiguous, their prospects uncertain. When captured or killed, they occupied a gray zone of responsibility, further highlighting the transactional nature of manpower acquisition. This approach solved immediate numerical shortages, while deepening ethical and diplomatic costs that extended well beyond the battlefield. The cumulative effect was a form of societal attrition mirroring military losses. Institutions designed to manage civilian welfare struggled under the strain of displaced families, injured veterans, and psychological trauma. Healthcare systems faced growing demand, while local governments lacked resources to respond. Over time, the gap between state rhetoric and lived experience widened, reinforcing cynicism rather than solidarity. The war ceased to feel collective. It became something done to specific regions rather than endured by the nation as a whole. This fragmentation carried long-term strategic implications. A state can absorb military losses, but demographic erosion undermines future resilience. Fewer young workers mean lower economic growth, reduced tax bases, and weakened innovation. Social trust, once broken, is difficult to restore. By late 2025, these trends suggested that even a frozen conflict would not halt the damage already embedded in population structures. As the war's human cost redistributed unevenly across society, questions emerged about sustainability. How long can a state rely on the same regions and groups to replenish losses without provoking irreversible social rupture? And what happens when demographic decline becomes a strategic constraint rather than a background statistic? By the end of 2025, the strategic picture confronting Moscow had narrowed to a corridor with no clear exit. Military momentum stalled, not because of a single defeat, but because structural exhaustion limited every option. Large-scale offensives demanded manpower and logistics that no longer existed in sufficient balance. Defensive holding actions consumed the same depleted resources without offering recovery. The war settled into a pattern where time itself became an adversary, steadily degrading capacity rather than delivering advantage. From a strategic standpoint, the dilemma was stark. Escalation through broader mobilization risked domestic instability by drawing in populations previously insulated from the conflict. Maintaining the existing approach preserved political calm at the center, but accelerated erosion at the periphery. Each month of attrition weakened institutional coherence, reducing the ability to train, rotate, and regenerate forces. Victory in conventional terms receded not because of battlefield reversals alone, but because the system sustaining operations lost elasticity. This trajectory carried implications far beyond national borders. For Ukraine, the pattern confirmed that endurance and pressure could achieve effects disproportionate to territorial gains. By targeting logistics, morale, and decision-making structures, the conflict demonstrated how modern warfare punishes imbalance. For NATO and Western planners, the war offered sobering lessons about attrition, industrial capacity, and the centrality of human factors. Numerical strength proved less decisive than cohesion, credibility, and the perceived value of survival. The broader geopolitical environment in 2025 reinforced these dynamics. Simultaneous tensions in multiple regions stretched global attention and resources, increasing the premium on sustainable force design. The conflict underscored that wars are no longer decided solely by firepower, but by the resilience of societies and institutions behind the front lines. States unable to protect their own soldiers' dignity struggle to project power consistently. Within Russia, leadership responses emphasized control over adaptation. Purges, arrests, and shifting blame signaled insecurity rather than confidence. Decision-making became centralized to avoid risk, slowing response times and discouraging initiative. In such an environment, commanders prioritized self-preservation over innovation. This paralysis fed back into battlefield outcomes, reinforcing the cycle of stagnation and loss. By late 2025, the war's defining feature was not movement on maps, but transformation within systems. An army still capable of fighting could no longer guarantee purpose to those ordered to do so. That gap between command intent and soldier belief represented the conflict's most consequential fault line. When belief erodes faster than material strategic options collapse inward, the conflict thus arrived at a paradox. Continuing promised only gradual depletion, yet altering course carried political risk. For observers, the question shifted from who would advance next to how long a state can function under sustained self-consumption. If wars ultimately test the alignment between power, legitimacy, and human endurance, what does the current trajectory suggest about the limits of coercion in modern conflict? And how might this reshape strategic thinking well beyond this battlefield?